on this trip across the ocean, I thought it would be fun to do some studies on some of our church fathers, because many of them came from England and from Scotland. So the one I want to do this first time really is John Newton. John Newton, you know, wrote Amazing Grace. And it's interesting because I got most of the information about him from a book called Captured by Grace by David Jeremiah, who many of you have heard. He wrote a really, really good book. You might like to read on that. In 1773, I have to remember, John Newton lived back in that time, 1773, he was reading 1 Chronicles 17:16, where King David said, "Who am I, O Lord?" And John Newton was so overcome by that statement because he realized that was him. And some of the things that he had done in his earlier life when he was such a reprobate, really, he got a hold of the idea of amazing grace. Amazing grace. And so he wrote this song about then. Let me just tell you a little bit about his background. He was born in Olney, Illinois. There is an Olney, Illinois. Olney, in fact, I've been there. It's Olney, England is where he was born. He lost his mother, who is a devout Christian, before he was 6 years old, or right about the time he was 6 years old. And his father was a ship captain, so he just took him on board, and he just got, you know, really kind of instructed really by the other sailors on the ship. And by the time he was 17, John Newton was on the open seas, a full-blown captain. The world was his teacher. And for 7 years, he left the faith of his mother and became a real reprobate. He became a slave trader. And even after he became a believer, he still did this as a trade. It was his livelihood. And one day he was overcome by the fact that here in the bottom of his ship were people that he had taken as slaves, black people from Africa, and he was taking them over to the new land to become slaves on rice and cotton plantations. And he realized that he was as much a slave as they were, that he was a slave to the world and to, even though he was a believer at that time. And it made him really, really take second thoughts about what he was doing. He was on a freighter one time, bound for Africa to get slaves, and he was bringing them back to South Carolina when this really hit him. It's interesting that he had several real close calls with his life, and I want to tell you about them. The first time was when he was very young. He was in a shooting party, and he almost lost his life when he was scrambling to get over a wall, and his gun went off and almost killed him. Then the second time was in 1748. He was in a terrible storm on the ship, and the captain sent him on an errand to a lower deck, and the man that took his place was washed overboard by a wave and drowned. Then the third time was just 3 weeks later. He was anchored in Ireland. A storm returned, and if they had been on the open sea, the ship would have been lost. And it just, by coincidence, happened to be docked, and he was saved. He began to really think about mercy at that point. The fourth time was on a river trip in Africa, and the captain pulled him away from a river boat and took him off the ship, and the man who took his place sank with the river boat. And then the fifth time, Newton himself tried to go overboard to get his hat that blew off, and he couldn't swim, and another man had to dive in and rescue him. So 5 times he was literally saved from the jaws of death. And that made him really, really think about God's mercy and his grace. He married his wife, whose name was Mary, in 1754, and that's when he accepted the call to be the pastor in Olney, England, and he pastored there for 16 years. Later he went to London, where he pastored for 28 years. You know, we don't think about John Newton being a pastor, but he was for many, many years. He was very instrumental in the abolition of slavery in Britain with Wilberforce. Then the slavery, of course, was finally abolished in 1833. Let's think about the song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And that song really speaks of Paul in the Bible. And John Newton was a real student of St. Paul. And, Paul was knocked off his horse when he was saved and blinded. And that just kind of equated with John Newton when he realized how blind he was to the mercy of God. Then we think about the second verse. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. And the third verse. Though many dangers, trials, and snares I have already come, 'tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And all the different times that he could have almost died, it was God's grace and mercy. John Newton always knew that. The last verse that we love to sing, when we've been there for 10,000 years, was not written by John Newton. That was added at another time. But I think he would very definitely have approved of that verse. Next time you sing Amazing Grace, don't think just about the tune and the bagpipes and that kind of thing, but think about the man who wrote those words, John Newton, who had a wonderful, wonderful pastorate in the country of England and rode on these very oceans that we're sailing on right now, back and forth from America to Africa and back and forth until he really felt God's mercy and grace and stopped the slave trade. Bye.